We talked a little bit about some of the components
that we believe that it's very important is for us to take. So today we're going to learn about personality.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the HUD OCIO Learning Session. I'm Dr. Melanie Cohen. We have a wonderful topic in store today and a wonderful discussion. We're going to be discussing the role of culture in a performance organization. And so we're very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Andrew Rahman. Andrew is affiliated with the FDIC as an associate professor, also with American University as a professor, as well as the Center for Creative Leadership. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Melanie, very much for inviting me to speak on a very important topic today, one that affects all of the government and, in fact, private institutions. And first of all, may I also say thank you very much for hosting this. This is of great service to our federal community, this topic and other topics just like it. Let me take a couple of minutes, Melanie, and go through some of my slides to introduce or to tee up the topic of culture and why it's so important. Today, though, we'll look at culture in these four areas. We can't look at culture just simply for the sake of culture. We have to think about it in terms of how do we engage our employees, the important role of values, and then let's look at how do we actually start to do the culture change. We know that the government is under relenting pressure right now. There are organizational changes. We're being asked to do more with less. People are asked, or organizations are being asked, to work across silos, think of strategies that leverage each other's talents. So the need to actually understand how do we work together, how do we change the way we're doing business to fit with what the external demands are, or even the internal demands are, is very, very important for us right now. So the first slide I'd like to bring to you is there is an awareness that there is a need for culture. In a recent publication, federal managers recognized, 79% of them, that one of their biggest goals is the management of culture in their organizations. And that's a provocative statement. How do we manage culture for culture's sake? How do we manage culture to reach our strategic advantage? How do we manage culture to engage our workforce so that they're more productive and happier at their workforce? 79%, that's a large number. When we think about culture, what is it then? Culture ultimately is around our shared beliefs, our norms, our behaviors. It's summed up in this is how we do things around here. Culture then is felt. It's seen in our behaviors. It's perceived. There are different areas of culture that we have to take into account, though, when we think about it and how we express it as a collective in a group. If we think about culture, we may think about it in terms of a metaphor, and we have three layers of that. Underlying culture are our assumptions about how things are. We often hear people in organizations say, let me show you the ropes. This is how we do things around here. And underlying that is this idea of this unspoken, unchallenged belief system. We're assuming things to be right. Management is out to get us. We won't get promoted. This is how we do things here. These are assumptions that we have about our workforce. Those assumptions build up over time. They become shared and they create values. And that's what's at the waterline. So if we say we have a value around teamwork or innovation, we have some assumptions about what teamwork and innovation can look like. And values are good. We need them. Those values become collected together to create belief systems. Those belief systems then drive what our environment sees, which is our behavior, our artifacts, our symbols in the workforce. That's how we know that there's a value in the workforce. Oftentimes I've gone into organizations or agencies, as I'm sure many of our audience have too, and we see the values stamped on the side of the building or they're inside the building. But when we actually start to talk to people about their values, they have a difficult time articulating those values in terms of what they're seeing day to day. So ultimately, culture hinges on this idea that we need to be able to understand what our values are, what the values mean, and how we actually actualize or articulate those values in our behavior. So the metaphor of an iceberg is a wonderful one to allow us to see that culture is just not what we see. We have values and then we have assumptions that lay below the waterline. Culture does a couple of things for us then. First thing I'd probably say to you is that it's a survival technique. It's built up over time. We've learned learned lessons in our workplace around how we should be, what works for us, what doesn't work for us. We reinforce those lessons over time by acting out those behaviors, and good behaviors, if you will. So over time, collectively, we start to share this value system, we share these behaviors, and they become our script, so to speak. And that's what makes changing culture hard. It becomes a script for us, and that we follow it. It becomes an unspoken script, and we follow it. So it's lessons learned over time for our survival. So what does culture actually do for us then? Well, as you can see, culture provides a number of different things for us. It provides our identity to an organization. Think about Department of Defense, the Marine Corps, strong identity. Culture generates commitment to us, commitment to the organization. If we are embodied with the organization's culture and we're in sync with them with our own personal values, we have commitment. Culture then is a control mechanism, and control mechanism in a good way, that it allows us to operate within certain barriers and constructs so that we can get ahead, so we can perform well. Culture then also allows us to reinforce values, and consequently it affects organizational performance. So culture is the secret sauce, if you will, of many organizations. And here's something important about culture that we should know. We either are intentional about creating our culture, or our culture will create us. Well, what does it mean then when we hear about organizations that say, well, we have a strong culture in our workforce? We want strong cultures. Strong cultures then align people to a way of being. Well, let's also keep in mind, though, a strong culture is not a rigid culture. A strong culture is one where the values are articulated, people can speak to the values. A rigid culture becomes one where there are unspoken values and assumptions that no one is willing to address. So when we have a strong culture, we have one that, if it's rooted in values like teamwork, we have one then that we allow people to come up to the surface and bring out the explicit, the implicit to the explicit in our culture. With that, let me just stop and pause and take some questions and have a conversation around culture.
Okay. Well, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Do we have any? Oh, okay, great. Let's go to the audience.
Thank you for that overview of culture. That's a fantastic way of framing out the issue, particularly the need to have it discussed and to have culture be a conversation that's ongoing in the organization. And from a tactical level, one of the challenges that we see is that conversation may be happening in the C-suite, but it's not necessarily rolling down to the team meetings and the management level, working with their groups. What advice or thoughts do you have on how you really promote that conversation throughout an organization instead of just at the top?
Great question, and thank you for asking. And it's, in fact, the norm, not the exception, that culture is commonly discussed in the C-suite around, we need culture change here. At the water cooler, the conversations aren't the same. The questions become, why do we need change here, for instance? Why do we do things this way? And so we have in organizations bifurcated or different cultures in different departments. The glue that holds all the cultures together, wherever they are, is around communication. If we have values that we hold in the C-suite, shouldn't they be the same values that we hold at all levels of the organizations? If you're at the SES or at the 14 and 15, a manager of managers, or if you're an individual contributor, our values should be the same throughout the organizations. They may show up differently from a level 1 to a level 4, how we actualize them. But in order to have all of the enterprise, the organization engaged in it, we need communication. And that communication has to start from the top, and it has to be open and transparent. And if it's based around what are our values that create our culture, it becomes much more easier to talk about those.
Thank you. Let me echo my colleague by thanking you, Dr. Rahman, for a nice, solid overview of Introduction to Culture. I'm John O'Brien, and I'm from the National Defense University. I liked your comment, we create culture, or culture creates us. So let me ask you, based on that metaphor you outlined, do you think there is such a thing as a public sector culture? Is there a private sector culture? Is there a military culture vice a civilian? Do you see people identifying themselves by these labels?
Terrific question.
Good questions. So the question is, are there in fact cultures representing both the private, the public sector? And I'd answer that by saying, yes, there are. There are perceptions about culture also. My perception is your reality. I love that statement because we have within the public sector or in the private sector perceptions about how we see other people. Within the government sector, we have perceptions about how we see ourselves. I've been very fortunate over the last 25, 26 years of working in the federal government and retired from the federal government before I became associated with the FDIC. I worked with people within the State Department, within DOD, at the Federal Reserve Board, at the FDIC, whose perceptions were one about innovation, one about moving forward, one about doing good work in service of our public, of the United States, whether it was here in the United States or abroad. So the perception is very much a reality. The perception is also important when we think about it in terms of how do we actualize our values and what are our assumptions about ourselves. So I think there are perceptions that we might have about the public sector, or I should say about the private sector from the government, that perhaps the private sector is more innovative than we are. They're more readily available to react than we are. The private sector may be looking at the government saying, they're a little bit top-heavy, they're bureaucratic, and there's nothing wrong with bureaucracy. We do need bureaucracy. What I would find, though, to be different or perhaps room for discussion is the perception that we have really needs to be rooted in how we actually show up at our workplace and what the assumptions we have about that. Are they in fact true? That's where I think it's important to be able to communicate what we think about perceptions.
Okay, and it looks like we have a follow-up.
Just a quick follow-up, Doctor. So based on your answer, what are the challenges for senior leaders, say in the public sector, who have to deal with these pockets of employees and so forth?
So the challenges, I think, for any senior leader in an organization, whether it's at the SES level, a 15, a 14, or a 13, is how do we manage perceptions? And the one thing I could probably say that is well worth it is being transparent about what those perceptions are. Let's make the implicit explicit. Let's communicate what our perceptions are. Let's bring out what those perceptions are, and let's test them.
You know, one thing I'd like to talk about before we move on, because I know you have a lot of information to discuss, but one of the slides you just showed was the organizational iceberg.
Yes.
And I think a little bit, people don't tend to understand that completely because the iceberg, 87% or 83% of the iceberg is underwater, 17% is above water. Mm-hmm. And so the difference there is the espoused values are so small in comparison to what's really going on in an organization underneath the surface. And one of the things we're talking about foundationally is creating change. Mm-hmm. And that's really why I think, and maybe you could talk a little bit about it as we move further with some examples perhaps, how it's so difficult really to create change, mm-hmm. because that's really your organization.
Absolutely. That iceberg is a wonderful metaphor, as you said, Melanie, for that reason. Everything is below the water line. And oftentimes, we are unable to articulate what our assumptions are. But we hear about those assumptions in the water cooler conversations or at the lunchroom table. So being able to understand what are our assumptions that are driving these values is really, really important. Let me give you an example of one. If I say to you, I'd like to give you some feedback, would you be left with a feeling of, uh-oh, or would you feel, oh, this is a good thing. This is around my development. If I say to you, that's not how we do things around here, or this is how we do things around here, what's your perception about that comment? How do you feel about that comment? And are we willing to make that explicit to others around what our perceptions are? So what's below the waterline is in fact very, very important, and what's at the waterline. I think it's the senior leader's job, really, is to be able to make explicit what are those perceptions and assumptions that we have about our organization, about our workforce, about what our strategies are, about how we're going to meet those strategies, and make them explicit in the sense of Well, let's create some values around that, and let's create the transparent conversation around that. Think Caterpillar, the organization Caterpillar, the private company. They went through a culture change a number of years ago. And in order to do so, like any other organization would, you have to have the conversation. You have to create the vision. You have to have the guiding coalition. You have to have people that are ambassadors to this. So their idea worked out very well, which was they had senior leaders talking about the strategy and where they wanted to go. Then they brought that conversation down into the workforce to make those perceptions about the strategy, perceptions about the workforce more explicit.
Okay, great. Well, I know you have a lot of other topics to talk about, so let's just continue, and then as questions come in, we'll go to those.
Okay, so we've had a pretty good sounding around what is culture, what does culture do for us, how do we actually think about culture. Consequently, we can't talk about culture unless we talk about our workforce. And this, I believe, is incredibly important, especially now in the federal government. When we think about our workforce, we're talking now about engagement. When we think about engagement, we have to think about it in two ways, or we can think about it in two ways. We have people that are committed to the government for a couple of different reasons. The first one is there's a rational commitment. And a rational commitment is ultimately boils down to cost to benefit. It's what's in it for me. And in a good way. I'm coming to work. What am I actually getting out of this? So I'm committed to my work. I'm committed to the job that I do. The second area of commitment is really one around emotional commitment. An emotional commitment then is around, well, how committed am I to my manager, to my team, to my organization? We know that most people leave their jobs not because they don't like the organization. It's their commitment level towards their team, their managers, their direct supervisors, their senior raters, up 2 levels, if you will. So now we have 2 forms of commitment, rational and emotional commitment. And it shows up in our day-to-day work. And it shows up in our day-to-day work in terms of what we do at our desks, how we work with our team, how committed are we with our team, how committed are we to our management, our manager, if you will. And finally, how committed are we to our organization? Well, that commitment then gives us 2 things. The first it results in discretionary effort. And discretionary effort is, how much am I willing to put in? What's my performance level? Am I operating at 100%? Or am I operating at, say, 40 or 50 or 60%, if you will? The second area it shows up in is retention. Retention is, am I willing to stay at this organization? And these 2 go hand in hand. Am I willing to stay at this organization at my operating level? Is it comfortable? Whatever level I am at, 40, 50%, or 80%. So commitment becomes important to our performance and our retention level. The question then becomes, what impact does this actually have on performance? There's a business case to be made for employee engagement, and a very, very strong business case to be made. There's a couple numbers here, the 10-6-2 rule, and it is for every 10% increase in commitment, it increases employee effort by 6%. That 6% results in improving performance by 2%. So let's just, for the sake of the conversation, say we had 25 people, and we were able to increase their commitment by 10%. And then the effort that they put into their work was an additional 6%. That resulted in 2% more. We have 25 people operating at an additional 2% productivity or performance level, and that includes their ability to innovate, the ability to be creative, their ability to build teams, their ability to walk across silos, to build bridges, if you will. That's a pretty significant case for that. You may be asking, where did I get this number from? Or where does this come from? It comes from the Corporate Executive Board. They did a study of about 50,000 employees. And so this is well rooted in research. The second number I'd give you is the 10-6 rule. For every 10% increase in commitment, it decreases the employee's probability of departure by 9%. So now we're talking about retention. What does it cost us when we lose an employee or when they leave to go somewhere else? We have a lot of downtime. And in an environment where we're trying to work smarter, we're working more with less, we're really focused on let's keep our best employees. And so the case for engagement is around performance, and it is also around keeping our employees' retention. So Here's how it typically looks in an organization. From the graph, you see two colors, the dark blue and the light blue. The dark blue normal graph is typically how things are. The majority of our workforce is within the normal bell-shaped curve, which is around slightly disengaged, neutral to slightly engaged. We have those that are on the far left, which are completely disengaged, and we have those that are engaged. If we applied the 10-6-2 rule, if we applied some mechanism to create commitment with our employees, and from that mechanism we had more effort, and from the effort we had performance, we could see the shift in our population go from slightly engaged to neutral to somewhat engaged, more towards being engaged, being committed, wanting to be at my workplace. So there's a business case here for around having engagement. The question we come up with then is, are people noticing that? And I'd say the answer is yes. The Federal Employee Viewpoint Workforce, our other reports that have come out, creating the next change of the federal human capital, senior leaders are define the goals and how to get there. They are responsible for making clear to employees how their work fits in. They are responsible for the kind of culture that they want. And in order to have the kind of culture they want, they are also recognizing, hey, we're in an environment of working harder, if you will, or doing more work with less. How do I engage my employees to be part of the team, to bring their A game with me? So engagement has an important aspect to this. Okay. Thank you.
So let me ask you a question about that, and we can talk about that, and maybe the audience can chime in too. So we know that the most pivotal relationship in the organization is between the employee and their immediate supervisor.
Yes.
We know that from a variety of sources, and we know that from research. So if that's not working, nothing's working. Nothing the leadership can put in is going to affect a huge change. So do you have any ideas on how we can begin to get that conversation going to create that change? Because again, we keep talking about creating the change.
Correct. So that's an excellent question. It makes it sound like, what are we doing? Are we doing enough to create the leaders in our workforce, leaders at all levels of the organization, whether you're SES, a supervisory 14 or 15, a supervisory 13, a 12, or an 11? Are we doing enough to create leaders within the organization? What does their leadership development look like? It isn't, oh, I'm a GS11 now or a GS12. I've now applied for a supervisory position and I've got it. Great. What an opportunity. Do you have the skills to have that supervisory position in the sense of engaging your workforce? So one thing we can be doing, and I think several organizations are doing a very good job about this, is creating the leaders at all levels in the organization. And when I say create the leaders, we think about leadership not in terms of management, around managing the books, around managing the bureaucracy, about managing the workflow. I'm also balancing that with leaders at the organization that are doing things such as creating the vision for the work team. And you can be a leader of a work team of 4 or 5. Are you creating the vision? Are you creating alignment within your team in such that people are committed to that vision? Are we listening and creating an environment where we value our staffs, our direct reports, by being inclusive, by welcoming communication? So communication, I think, is ultimately a pivotal point in any change effort that we make within the federal government.
You know, and just a point I wanted to bring out, as you were talking, I was thinking about it, you know, leadership is not hierarchical.
Correct.
And I remember reading from a very noted leadership scholar, Warren Bennis, that in the public sector, your responsibility is really, as a leader, is to create other leaders. That's
Absolutely.
really, that's one of the quotes he uses. That's really what you're supposed to be doing, to create the future of the public sector.
Absolutely.
And so that's really a key piece of what everybody should be doing.
Absolutely. Let me make a comment on that. Warren Bennis, we create leaders, and I use this phrase, who we lead behind. One of the primary purposes of leadership is who do we lead behind, in the sense of if we create vision, alignment, and direction, we need to be able to have that very same idea, that very same construct held by all leaders in the organization so that they're aligned to the overall organizational vision. The other part around leadership is, an important part of leadership is to create the culture. And if we create the culture, an interdependent culture versus one that's dependent, then we create a culture where we have leadership at all levels that are aligned. We also create that what our values are within that organization, such as if we're going to create leaders, well, how do we create vision? How do we have people align themselves to that vision? How do we create commitment? And one way we do that is helping people see what their role is to the overall objectives, whether it's of the team or of the organization itself.
Okay, let me see if we have any questions. We do. Okay.
So absolutely fascinated by this conversation about how we push that culture down through, particularly to the frontline manager, where most of the action is really happening as far as employee commitment goes. And one of the competing theories that's coming up in some of the work being done by Jamie Nodder and some of the other people researching on a lot of the newer, more millennial organizations is talking about how having a strong hierarchy has actually eroded some of our ability to make these conversations about values explicit. Because you don't have to make them explicit, you just know who's responsible for making the decision, and then they make it, and that solves the need for conflict around what the right answer is, because the right answer follows the hierarchy. How do we, as we're selecting leaders and managers, prepare them to be more fluid in that hierarchy and step away from that? Because as we become more fluid, we have to actually surface conversations. There's been some really interesting stuff coming out of Zappos and what they've been doing with their new approaches to management. And that's been their key learning of the more they step out of the hierarchy and start pulling leadership at all levels as an actual practical thing, the more conflict they're actually surfacing, because they can't solve it just by saying so-and-so is in charge and they made the decision. How do we equip our leaders to begin to be explicit and be inclusive and do those things that you really talked about for getting workforce opinions in and engaged, so that we can see these mission results?
Okay, great question, and this is a multi-level question. So let's first of all operate under the context that, and I had said bureaucracy is good. And bureaucracy is good. It provides us with a way to communicate. And the hierarchy that we have, whether it's in the federal system or in the private system, provides us with a structure to pass information forward and to have information come down. If we think about, or what are our perceptions about hierarchy, that has a pivotal point in determining how do we create leaders at all levels. For some, hierarchy is around command and control, which is the decisions are made at the next level up. For others, hierarchy is around, oh, now I have a structure in place to be able to pass information up to people who are ultimately responsible at different layers in the organization for its outcomes. That doesn't relieve me from my obligation to make decisions. I love this word empowerment, and we use it in the workforce all the time. You're empowered to act. Well, to empower someone to act means to give them power to make decisions. That can be thought of as different than the hierarchy. We can use the hierarchy as a way to create information channels, workflow. We can also empower our organization, our staff members, to work across boundaries, to make decisions across boundaries. So earlier we talked about the role of engagement, we talked about the role of culture and how important it is to make the implicit explicit in what we think of as culture. Hierarchy is a wonderful example about that. What are our perceptions about hierarchy in our organization? What are our assumptions about hierarchy? Are we assuming that we're operating in a system where decisions, if we have to make a decision, we need to go one layer up? Or do we have an alternate assumption, which is, are we assuming that if I make a decision at my point in the hierarchy and I inform my supervisor, if you will, it is still my decision and it will be supported by that, by my supervisor and my supervisor's supervisor. So perception becomes incredibly important when we start thinking about how do we create the hierarchy. This is a topic it's really fascinating, and I know a number of companies like Zappos, Google, have thought about, do we need a different hierarchical structure in our workplace from the traditional line? And we think about metaphors such as the spider's web, where it's intricately sewn together. If you move one part of the web, the whole web reverberates. I think there's room for both. I think there's room for the traditional hierarchy as we know it, in terms of passing information forward, in terms of division of labor. But I think what we also need is that leadership, the value, the culture that says we need to be able to work across the hierarchy, across boundaries. We need to maybe instill in our leaders the value of networking. If we want to create great leadership, one way we can do so is to get people interacting with one another, because we learn about leadership by getting feedback and modeling other people's behavior. And what a wonderful way then to be able to have networks around the organization. If I could, Melanie, let me just pull on to something Dr. Marquardt said last time he was here in February. So Dr. Marquardt spoke on action learning, and you can see his videotape on the HUD site. He mentioned that action learning was around developing leaders. Oh yeah, and we're also solving organizational problems. But when we develop leaders, we have them talking to each other across the organization, across silos. Here's an example of how we can use action learning, but also leadership development to create the culture we want.
Okay, I think we have one more question, and then we'll let you continue forward, because I know there's a lot more information.
Thank you, Doctor. A bit of a rhetorical question. So would you say, based on going back to the metaphor of the previous section with the iceberg, are good leaders assumption busters?
A good leader is assumption buster. I like that. A good leader makes explicit the implicit assumptions that we hold in our organization. A good leader, and whether that's at all levels, is willing to be able to raise the question. I have an assumption about this. Here's what I'm thinking about this. Am I reading this correctly? Are a couple of phrases we could say. But well put, a good leader is willing to look at the assumptions that create the values, and are those values the right ones for our organizational strategy today? Good question.
Okay, great. Yeah, go right ahead. Continue on, because I know there's lots of other information.
Okay. So far we've chatted about what is culture, and then we've also chatted about the importance around employee engagement. You've also heard me talking about values. Well, I mentioned to you that values, we go into organizations and we have values and we see them in the workplace, or sometimes we don't know what those values are. But all of those values become evident to us, whether they're spoken or unspoken, in our behaviors. So one aspect of culture that is very, very important is the role values play in our workforce. So as Tolstoy once said, structure leads us to outcomes. And what he meant by that is something similar to what Churchill might have said. We build houses, and then they build us. We are conformed by the values we hold, by the structure that's in place. We act in those ways, and those ways become, whether they're implicit or explicit, become our values. So values then serve several purposes for us. They are the foundation for our behavior within an organization, or they could be, if you will, whether they're implicit or explicit. Values are our belief system. These are things that we hold tight to us. And values guide us in making decisions. So if there are values in our workforce around teamwork, around innovation, we're going to show up that way. We're going to act in that way. If there are implicit values about who sits at the head of the table, or what you wear at the table, or who speaks to who, or what the reporting chain of command is, the command and control, we're also going to act in that way. So values both at the implicit level and the explicit level become guiding forces for us, and guiding forces for supervisors, for leaders, to engaging their workforce. Hence, the need for explicit values is very, very important. Well, the question becomes, wait a second. Aren't we supposed to check our personal values at the door before we come to work? Are we supposed to leave our belief system, leave our emotions at the door when we come to work? I'd offer a different perspective. The perspective is that there needs to be congruence. If we want commitment, effort, and performance, one way we can get it is ensuring that the values that we bring to work and that the values that the organization have, there's overlap and there's congruency. They don't necessarily need to be 100% the same, but there does need to be some congruency. And the reason I think this is important is, think about a time where you've been in a work environment or a situation where there was a disjuncture, or your value system was different of the team you were on, of the organization you were on, and the conflict that you felt. Did you bring your A game with you? Did you perform at the highest possible level? Were you engaged? Were you committed to the task? For most of us, the answer is no. If we think about employees or staff members, and I think we've all seen this, is where we have staff members, our friends, our peers, our colleagues, our bosses, where there may be a disjuncture of values. They ultimately may leave the organization. So we've lost productivity, if you will. So the importance of bringing values is really around, let's decide what we stand for. Let's decide that we're going to be working together. And in congruency with your values, your organization values, and your personal values, they lead you to that effort. Well, how do you actually do that? And this is the $24,000 question. And throughout this hour, if you remember anything, I hope it's this slide right here. And this is an important slide. Because we often say, well, we have the value of teamwork. But my value of teamwork may be different than your value of teamwork. My value of teamwork may be different than Melanie's value of teamwork. My value of innovation, how I hold innovation, could be different than yours. So it becomes really important to make explicit, what do we mean when we say the values? If our values are articulated into behaviors, let's call those behaviors commitments. And let's start to identify what those commitments really are and get clarity about why this is an important value to us. If we can identify those commitments, those behaviors, we have a way of being able to provide productive feedback to each other. We have a way of being able to think about our annual performance and our mid-year performance and our quarterly performance in terms of a lens to look through of. We have a way of thinking these values are associated with our strategy. These values are also my values. So being able to identify what our values are and then what our behaviors are is incredibly important. And here's who I think has done it well as one example. The FDIC. Several years ago, they made a decision to create the culture that they wanted to do. And as part of that decision, they identified in groups, in work, in focus groups, what are the values that are important to the organization. And from those values, they started to think about what are our commitments? How will we actually behave in this value? And so they developed commitments, if you will. So integrity is around decision making will be transparent and clearly explained. So those aren't just words on a card, if you will. By the way, each employee has one of those cards. By the way, each of the senior leaders in the suite of courses that the FDIC teaches, 5 core courses, 40 electives, values is an important component of that discussion of leadership development. And it's so important that senior leaders come to these courses to talk about values. So we have now a situation, whether it's at the FDIC or others, where we've made explicit the values, we've made explicit our commitment to those values. Now we have a script, if you will. We have a prism, a lens to look through in terms of how are we doing? How are we meeting our strategy? How are we giving each other feedback? So values is very, very important, and I would say to that. So it becomes down to, well, it's value-based leadership. It's an explicit way of making sure that everyone knows what we're standing for, what we stand for, how we're going to be as we go forward. So value-based leadership is important here. Let me leave it with that and pause for conversation.
Okay, let me see if there's any questions from the audience. Do we have any questions? Oh, well, I have a question. We'll wait for the audience to come up with a question. So the interesting thing about values, I think, is that, of course, each organization has stated values. But what you find is what you talked about, where the behavior is not the same as the stated values.
Absolutely.
So you find, and then again, that goes into the iceberg, I think, where you have what's espoused versus what's really happening. So when you have situations like that, I know you can't answer this question in a sentence or two, but when you have those kind of situations, how do you see overcoming challenges like that?
Absolutely. Great question. So let's have an example of that. I'm sure the population out there has heard of this. We have an open door policy. And the open door is about 6 inches. Or check in with my administrative assistant before you come to my open door, if you will. So there's an espoused value, the one that we say, and then there's a value where there's theory or theories in use, if you will. So where it's really not the value that we say we're having. If we make explicit the value that we have an open door policy, let's make explicit the behaviors around that. Let's make it explicit enough where people actually get to live that value at all levels of the organization, whether it's the open door policy or one around teamwork, if you will. Your question speaks to what's below the surface, those values that are not made explicit. And we know what those values are if we start to watch people's behavior. So for instance, you're at a staff meeting. And at the end of the staff meeting, there's an agenda. The head of the table may say, well, are there any questions? And there are no questions. But once you leave the room, there's a lot of talk around the water cooler about what that staff meeting was. There's an implicit value there around not raising questions. And so the leader's role then is to be able to live those values, model those values. Earlier I had said that if there are two ways that we can develop leaders in our organization, one is to be able to provide them feedback. Let's provide them feedback on the impact of their work, on the impact of their interpersonal skills, and let's also model the behavior that we have as leaders in the organization of the values that we want to have within the organization. And at a time where we really are working or doing more with less, where we're under a considerable amount of pressure, where we're having to look at our strategies, combine strategies to create different ones, working across organizations, the imperative of a leader now is to model the way.
Okay, I think we do have a question from the audience. Well, we have two questions from the audience.
After you, sir.
Interesting point. It sounds like you're almost saying that old expression, what gets measured gets done, or measures drive behavior. So you're saying that by driving the behavior of a senior leader in that meeting setting to encourage questions will ultimately change the behavior of the workforce and lead to a more high-performing organization all around.
Absolutely. If we go to meetings and senior leaders are asking, asking, are there any questions, and no one's responding, perhaps it's the senior leader's role or the leader's role in that say, well, I have a couple of questions. Is there anything left unsaid? If I was going to ask myself a question, this is what it would be. So they have to model the behavior. I've seen in organizations, and I've had the good fortune to work in a number of organizations, the State Department, Department of Defense, both the Army and the Navy, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, over a 26-year period, and lived in 6 countries, worked in another 30 on behalf of the government. So it's been a wonderful experience. I've seen leaders do this very, very well, where they have driven the behavior, if you will, by modeling the way for others. I've also seen leaders, as I think we all have, where there's a great catchphrase of the day, but there's no explanation of it. Make it a great day. Okay. Or we're all a team here, but there's nothing to back that up in terms of model that way for us. Show me how it's done, because I'm going to replicate you. If we know one thing about leadership, is that people are watching. People are watching their leaders. They want to be connected to their leaders. A couple of days ago, I had an opportunity to sit down with another gentleman from another agency. I do some mentoring and some coaching because I guess I'm a seasoned person in the government at this point after 26 or 27 years. And so I mentor and coach people. And he said to me, well, I'm in this position now of senior level. He's SES level. I'm thinking about meeting with my staff that are 2 and 3 levels down. What are you thinking about that? I really wanted to just stand up and applaud for him right there, because if we're going to model behavior, let's do it at all levels, not just with our senior team. If we're a GS-13, let's make sure we spend our time with someone that's new to the organization that may be a GS-9. We each have a role to mentor and to coach each other if we are going to perform at a higher level.
Right, exactly. So we have one more question.
That question of levels is actually exactly what I wanted to get to. If we can pause the iceberg conversation for a minute and bring in onions. We have this layer after layer after layer of organization in the federal government, whether it's our program office or our agency or the fact that we're federal government altogether. And ultimately when we're talking about values, the oath that we all took as civil servants was to the Constitution, which is a very values-driven document and carries the values for all of us, which we then have to break down to our local context. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or guidance about what level is the right level of context for that. Here at HUD, we're slightly less than an 8,000 person agency, which I understand is a sub-bureau at DHS, in terms of how we stack all of that up. And then we have further divisions into our program offices, and then our field staff in those program offices. How far can a leader really expect to cascade their values through those levels? What's sort of the right span of, not span of control, but span of influence for those values to be thinking about where we should be shaping those, and how do they nest together?
Okay, that's a large question, and as the way I understand it is, I couch it in a different way. Can we in fact create organizational change by espousing our values at the senior level and making sure that they actually get to different levels in the organization? And how far down do we go? And I'd offer you the answer is yes. And we're seeing it in a number of different institutions. I've mentioned the FDIC. They went through an incredible organizational or culture change several years ago. And that permeated from the senior levels, from the chairman, all the way down into incoming examiners now. That's still going on right now. So I think that answer is yes. The question is, how do we do that? It can't be a talking point. We have to be able to walk the talk when we're making organizational change. And everyone needs to be able to walk the talk and model that behavior. It has to be able to be explained to people. Why are we doing this? What's the business need for this? What's the performance need for this? It has to be congruent amongst all levels. And one thing I said earlier is that we may not have our personal and professional values completely 100% aligned, but what we are looking for within the organization is alignment between the values at all levels of the organization and in the different so-called silos or the different branches. We know in organizations that we have cultures or subcultures within the different parts. Human resources may have their type of culture, law enforcement may have their type of culture, examiners may have their type of culture. However, I would offer to you that organizationally wide, there is a core set of values that we operate on that allows us to see the same picture, that allows us all to see the strategy that we're working towards, that allows us to create collective sense of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So how do you actually get this thing, get culture or values to permeate throughout the system? I think one of the key roles is around communication. Being able to communicate that, the purpose of the change, the purpose of the values, the purpose of the strategy, and how they fit in. I think making it visible is also very important. Are leaders at all levels walking the talk? And can our people at all levels articulate and demonstrate those values? Are they getting feedback on those values? If we say we value teamwork, let's do it right. Let's give our rising leaders, our aspiring leaders, feedback on teamwork. If we say we value innovation, are we creating the conditions as a leader in our organization to innovate? And are we rewarding that? I think that's one way that we can actually do this.
Well, that's terrific. I think that gets into the next part, which is you're talking about how do you transform a culture.
Exactly.
Right?
So for the last component of our conversation here, I thought it'd be worthwhile to tie all of this together. We've chatted about what is culture. We've chatted about the need to engage our work staff. And part of that engagement is, can we pivot ourselves on values and behaviors and assumptions of ways of being? Is there in fact any performance data or criteria that shows us culture impacts performance? And the answer is yes. And so there are a couple of studies that were done. The first one was done by Harvard University of 207 large firms over a long period of time that related to our culture drives our performance. There was a second study done by Dr. Dennison, who actually has a culture assessment instrument. It was a longitudinal study, international study, and he's done, this one is published, and there's also studies around the United States, where the findings are the same. How we show up in our culture drives our performance. Now, keeping in mind, our culture is just not something there. Culture is our behavior, culture is our norms, culture is our values, if you will. How do those impact how we perform at the job? So what I'd like to do for a couple of minutes then is to think about these different areas around, well, if you were going to start to think about your culture or changing your culture, there's probably a methodology to do that. And there is a methodology, if you will. We might need to do assessments. Let's find out where we are now so that we can figure out what we need to correct or leverage to get where we want to go. Let's create focus groups. In other words, let's get buy-in at all levels of the organization to see, is this really how it is? If I say I have an open door policy, is everybody else experiencing that open door policy? Let's talk about what culture we need. And that's a really great question. How do you decide on the culture that you need? I think one way to figure that out is, what's your strategy? Where are you going so that you can figure out what are the values that you need to have in place, and from those values, the behaviors you need to have. Here's an example. We often have organizational changes, and believe me, after a number of years in the government, I've been through a number of these organizational changes, or there's mergers or offices are combined. What sometimes isn't explained is why we're doing that. And from that, what is the strategy from that? What has to be different versus just putting two offices together or reorganizing or moving the deck chairs around just for the sake of moving them around? What culture do we want to have from that then? Oh, do we need more innovation? Do we need more teamwork? Do we need more boundary spanning, so to speak? Let's be able to articulate that. Let's create the infrastructure for that. And the infrastructure is around the systems. It could be around reporting channels. It could be around decision making. It could be around empowering people. Then let's create cultural ambassadors. Think JetBlue. They did an outstanding job of this, one that's really worth looking at in terms of cultural ambassadors, which is, we need, as John Cotter would say, we need that guiding coalition of people to create change. That's similar to what that is. Let's get people on board that are in influential positions, not so much from the hierarchy, but referential positions, or from their expertise, or from their trust by other colleagues, and help them to become ambassadors for our culture change. Then finally, let's integrate it. If we're going to make a culture change or a change in our organization, let's build it into our performance appraisals. Let's build it into our day-to-day feedback, if you will. So there are some ways to think about how do we actually assess culture, and how do we start to think about what needs to be changed. And this is Dan Dennison's work. Now, if you can see around it, there are four main areas around adaptability, mission, consistency, and involvement. And if you look below each one of those four quadrants, then you have three, if you will, sub-quadrants, if you will. And if you look at them, well, some of those look like values themselves. Teamwork, team orientation, customer focus, becoming a learning organization, having agreement or consistency within our values themselves. Those are values themselves. So if you want to start to, one way to think about assessing your values or thinking where you are is, where am I and where do I need to go? Identify what your organization's values are, and then start to go out and ask, whether it's a Likert scale or a focus groups, how are we doing in this area? This is an example where someone has taken, oh, let's look at all of our values as they relate to performance, tie them up, and let's do an assessment to them. So it's around mission, our direction, purpose, and blueprint of our organization. It's around consistency. What structures do we have to support our core values? Are we in agreement? Are they integrated? It's around involvement. How involved are we? How involved are we with our staff members? Do they have ownership? I mentioned earlier, if we're empowering our staff, that must mean they have power to do something. And the last one then is adaptability, which is, are we a learning organization? Are we focused on our external world? Are we being able to adapt to what the client needs? And I think that in the federal government has become very, very important. So an example would be, if we start at the bottom, if there's low consistency, you may see less color in it. So if there's high consistency, you may see more color in it. Another way to think about this graphic would be, if we did a survey in your organization and we looked at the survey in terms of levels, all the SES, all the 14s and 15s that are supervisors, and then all our individual contributors, we asked them the same questions around mission, consistency, adaptability, working with our environment. Would we see similar results? This is where we start to know, Is our culture aligned at all levels of the organization? Are we holding on to the same values, and are they being acted out in the very same way? This example may look like what it could look like. Our senior level thinks, yeah, we have a very strong culture where from their level we're consistent. Maybe the folks that are individual contributors see it quite differently, where no, I don't see this actually happening with the same values. And so this would be an excellent starting point in terms of figuring out how do I create some culture change. So this was an example of one that I personally did in an organization some time ago, where we looked at 25 of the top leadership, or the top leadership team. Think about it then in terms of directors, deputy directors, and senior managers. And this was the average of all of their scores, if you will. Well, upon further examination, I looked at it in terms of different levels. This is what it looked like at the very senior team, 5, 6, 7 people, at the director level, the deputy director level, and then the senior team. What you can see from this is there is consistency. There is a strong culture. They all believed in the same things, but what did they believe? They had a strong orientation to a core value. They had a strong orientation to their mission, to customer service. But there are other areas that were not so strong, that allowed people to say, oh, well, if we're going to work on something to strengthen our mission, or strengthen our culture, here's a good way to think about it. Perhaps we need to spend more time on team orientation. Perhaps we need to articulate what our strategy is here. Perhaps we need to articulate how everybody's roles fit into that strategy so that they become committed to it. So the culture assessments ultimately want to do a couple of things. They want to create a conversation. It isn't about grading yourself as whether you have a strong culture or a weak culture. It's ultimately around moving towards organizational performance, because we know companies where there's an alignment between cultural values at all levels of the organization perform higher. So cultural assessments then is around moving towards creating that organization for us. So how do we actually then start to leverage that? For instance, in this diagram or in this example, if vision, mission, goals, objective, strategy, if they're a little weak, one thing we could do is our vision isn't communicated. So what we could do is gain alignment and ownership at each level by creating information sharing, hence the need to communicate. Is there a clear mission giving people meaning? If perhaps there's some room for improvement, what we could do is get feedback from our internal and external stakeholders. So for each one of those, then we can start to think about, well, how do we create alignment then?
Okay. Well, that's terrific. And what really makes a couple of points that come out to me most are the fact that you need to have those important conversations, right? And the other time is sometimes what we think is not really what's happening.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really the key. So with that, we're going to wrap up, and I would like to thank you very much, Andrew, for being with us today. I think we had a wonderful conversation. And for everyone, please look for us next month for our next HUD OCIO learning session. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you to our audience.